Speaker, I was pleased to add my name to new Clause 6 and congratulate my right honourable friends, the member for Barking and Sutton Coldfield, for bringing it forward. I won't repeat the powerful arguments that have been made for transparency, but and these were well made also in the second reading of this bill. Other than to say that progress has been made in the overseas territories, they have introduced central registers, but that is not sufficient for the reasons that have been given, that we need that transparency to shine a light on what is happening. And I suspect that the interrogation of the central registers by law enforcement authorities has actually been relatively little. And there also needs to be a step up in law enforcement action as well as these measures. There were two principal concerns that were adduced as to why we should not, or should at least hesitate before we compel the overseas territories to act. The first is potential economic damage to the overseas territories. I argued strongly at second reading that I did not think that should be an impediment to act. It can never be an argument that you should fail to act where something wrong is being done simply because there might be some economic consequences. It does, however, mean that we have a duty to ensure that those economic consequences are addressed and that we help to mitigate them. And I think there is a strong responsibility on this House and now the Government in accepting the amendment to ensure that there is no damage to the economies of the overseas territories for taking action which they may now be taking more rapidly than they wish to, particularly when you consider, for instance, the impact of the hurricane damage on the British Virgin Islands and so on. So that is a concern that should not prevent action but should be taken seriously. The second, of course, was the constitutional objection. Is it right for us to intervene? That is a serious argument. But again, I argued at second reading that if the harm that is being done is so great that it can no longer be ignored, there is a justification to act, and there clearly is a power to do so. And these are not just domestic matters for these overseas territories that we have decided to intervene in. They have a global impact. And it is therefore very important for the governments of the overseas territories to understand the reasons why this House has felt it so important to move, and if they can do so voluntarily ahead of any action being taken legislatively, then I think that would be very welcome. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving me on that important point. Does he accept, therefore, that it is for that reason only, that the Chief Minister of Gibraltar wrote the letter in terms that he did, because it is the Constitutional Convention that we do not normally legislate without their consent, and for that reason and that reason only that the Crown Dependencies, which have a good record of compliance, had concerns at this form of legislation, again undermining the doctrine long established that we do not legislate for them without their consent. It's not the objective that anyone objects to in any of those jurisdictions, but it's doing so through the normal constitutional process.
The Crown Dependencies did not fall under the ambit of new Clause 6, as my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, pointed out. They are in a different constitutional position. But I think that the wider point is this. I would have been minded to have accepted, had this House had the opportunity to consider it, the Government's compromise amendment, because I think that, if possible, we should have avoided dictating to the overseas territories what to do. But that option was not available, and I welcome the fact that that action is being taken. The key concession the Government made, actually, in agreeing to new Clause 6 was that it was no longer acceptable that the overseas territories should move only at the pace of the rest of the world. The key concession that the Government made, and the Minister, my right honourable friend, said this, is that he accepted that the will of the House was that the overseas territories should move ahead of the pace of the rest of the world, for reasons that have been very well made on either side. That said, I don't think we should lose sight of the objective here. The objective is not to force the overseas territories to take action. The objective is to ensure that we tackle corruption where we find it, and that has to be done on a global basis. And the arguments that there will be displacement, again, should not be an impediment to action, because we can never argue that we will not tackle a crime on one street corner in case, frankly, it moves to the next street corner. That can never be a moral argument or a reason not to take action. Nevertheless, it is a serious argument. What are we going to do to avoid displacement? And therefore, the imperative is on the Government and on this place, which has now forced this action, to support every effort possible to mobilise the global community behind transparency for everyone. And we will have taken a lead in this House, and the UK will have taken a lead, and we will have required our overseas territories to have taken a lead. But we now have to step up. And if that means taking initiatives such as my honourable friend, the anti-corruption champion, has suggested, which is of another global summit, in order to encourage action, whether it is through means such as the G20 or the G7, we must now drive action on a broader basis than simply the overseas territories or the Crown dependencies. I give way to my honourable friend.
Mr. Speaker, I completely back up what my honourable friend is saying, because the time for global action must be now in order to use the lead which we are going to create by imposing this and drive that and exert a global leadership. And it must be not just for transparency on company disclosures, but also transparency on trust disclosures and on other kinds of asset classes, as well as company shares too.
I agree with my honourable friend. In taking this action and ultimately, if necessary, requiring the overseas territories to act, we will have taken a grave step, one that has only been used twice before in relation to the decriminalisation of homosexuality and in relation to capital punishment. It is a serious move, and in doing so, therefore, the justification must be that we then use that to encourage action globally, and that is what I would urge the government to do.
Yeah.